So here we are, hang out on air with Dr. Rick Strassman. Firstly, I just would like to thank you, Dr. Strassman, not just for giving me some of your time today, but I think I can speak on behalf of many, many people all over the world in thanking you for taking the risks that you have taken in order to gain and share new knowledge, and also to express thanks to you and your cohorts for your various discoveries and contributions in a variety of scientific disciplines. I personally think that your pioneering work and subsequent discoveries and further lines of inquiry took great courage and vision to achieve. And really, we are very grateful, those of us who have taken inspiration and experienced such wonder and awe, listening to you talk, reading your books and watching your videos and so on. I'm hoping that I have some questions today that are going to be challenging for you to answer, and questions which will give you room to elucidate your ideas. But first, I'm interested to know what motivates you and how your past and your upbringing and your professional endeavors have shaped you. So let's start with your early childhood, and broadly, I'd like to know if you consider your childhood, your experience of childhood as positive.
Well, my childhood was kind of a mixed, bag in a number of ways. Were kind of troubled, but they did do the best they could with their own constitution. My, father, engineer, worked for a big aerospace company in Southern California, and he just to study, to get as much education as we could, as well in school as we could. He was one of those guys when I tested a 98 score, rather than congratulations, he'd say, "What about the other 2 points?" So the standards were pretty high when it came to academics. He was a housewife. I have an older brother, younger sister. I think when I was in junior high, she began to work. 3 of us became a little more self-sufficient and independent. I was raised in a conservative Jewish, household. Jewish, first, generation Americans. Parents came from Europe and Western Russia. And I went to Hebrew school, 2 hours Monday, Wednesday after school, and Sunday morning. In Hebrew, I learned a little bit about the Bible, but mostly we learned about Israel, the history. The Holocaust was never, far from minds. This was in the late, 50s, early 60s, which wasn't that long, from World War II. And the creation of the state of Israel took place in 1940. It wasn't an especially spiritual upbringing, but still it kind of the resilience and the creativity of the Jewish people and their tradition. I was gifted in some ways as a sociable. My teachers liked me. I had a lot of friends, with the guys when I was growing up. So I spent a lot of time out of the house because it was kind of full at home much of the time. But I got a lot of strokes, a lot of positive reinforcement from from my teachers, and combined with my genes, I did pretty well in school as a young kid. Yeah, you know, I was mostly interested in the sciences at the time, especially chemistry, making bombs and fireworks and liquids, you know, from one color to the other. And you know, as I actually began college as a chemistry major because I wanted to become a fireworks magnate, but I was discouraged. Everybody said, "Well, you're a smart guy. You should go to medical school, be a doctor." And people, I got the last laugh on them by the field of research I ended up in.
So you had a reasonably good relationship with your parents. Your father was perhaps over insistent on the sort of the education side of your life, and I wonder if you thought of him as kind and wise and brave.
Well, I wouldn't call him kind. You know, he had a really violent temper and he did drink. So that was a bad combination. But, you know, I always, thought of him as especially smart, stymied in his creativity. You know, he was a real, fan of, science fiction and huge closet full of science fiction books. I would root through those during the summers. I'd read 100 books per summer, science fiction. And he did, try his hand science fiction, but he never could quite pull it off. And, actually toward the end of his life, he took the GRE in order to maybe go back to school and, get some training as a psychologist, but were able to, fulfill that. So I think in some ways I'm carrying on the kind of interests and he would have liked to have done himself or was hoping for me to do. Some of the work I've done is kind of sci-fi. You give people substance in their vein and they're transported to other worlds and contact intelligent beings who communicate with them. So that certainly partakes of a certain sci-fi quality. Yeah, and
Yeah,
I became a psychiatrist, so kind of followed in his steps or potential footsteps in that way too.
yeah, yeah. My dad actually was the same. Still is just the same. He was very interested in science fiction, and even he did try his hand at writing fiction as well. Part of the reason I asked that is because, yeah, got that in common. Part of the reason I asked that is because I know that childhood experiences can have a huge influence on our behavior and our characters in later life. And especially for me in terms of your religious inclinations, your relationship with your father. I'm talking mainly about Christianity here, and I have seen a British mentalist, an entertainer. His name is Darren Brown. He did a show a little while ago called Fear and Faith, in which he tried to expose faith healers who were, fraudulently claiming to have these abilities to channel God's power to heal to heal people. But in one segment of that show, he took a scientist, actually a lady who was working on stem cell research, into a church, and through the power of suggestion, was able to, by associating her, not associating, but by steering her into a frame of mind in which she was thinking about her experiences of her father, who she had a great relationship with, who was very loving and kind and wise and brave. he was able to convert her. He's this mentalist, Darren Brown, is not religious himself, but he was able to convert her by kind of very quickly and deftly forming psychological triggers, which to make her regress to her childhood, and also have this feeling, this moving feeling that she, to do with her notions of her father. And thereafter she felt the touch of God in that moment. It's like 15 minutes she felt the touch of God. And I wonder, as a psychiatrist, how much you feel that religious inclination can be the result of childhood experiences and people's relationship with their father, with their parents.
Well, I mean, that's kind of how, Freud conceptualized religion, and in particular, the Jewish, faith. I mean, he was raised Jewish, and he, wrote a book about, Moses, Moses and monotheism. And he also wrote a book called The Future of an Illusion, specifically, religious, sensibilities in general. His belief was that went through an effective, psychoanalytic course of treatment, that they, become religious. That religion was a neurosis. On a large scale, institutional, religion was an institutional neurosis. That is the case sometimes, or even most of the time, in people who are members of religious organizations. Spinoza liked to define, or to differentiate between the religion of the masses and the religion of the elite. And the religion of the masses is focused on fear, which one could trace back to early childhood experiences of being afraid of your parents, and also loving your parents and hoping that they'll be there for you, or you're scared that they won't be there for you, or you hope they'll feed you, or you're afraid they won't feed you. And Spinoza, believed that the clergy religions would exploit the masses' tendency towards, fear and hope, for their own ends, for power, for fame, for money, in order to control the masses. So that is what Spinoza referred to as, the religion of the masses, or actually what he refers to as, superstition. And he contrasted that with, the religion of the elite, which he believed was only obtained in people who were keen students, or keen of the natural world, including their own psychology. So in other words, if you study mathematics, if you study physics, if you study biology and chemistry, if you study your own psychology, that you're ultimately, led to the origin of all of those, disciplines, all of those, phenomena. And as a result, you both attain some knowledge, creator and sustainer of those fields, those disciplines, those phenomena, world, and the psychological world. And as a result of that knowledge, you began to love the creator and sustainer of those systems, because of the wisdom and the kindness which is inherent in them. But that's a definition of religion that most people have never considered, and number two, would have a hard time attaining. Did.
Yeah. I want to ask you about your experience of school and college in, I believe it was 60s California. I can imagine a kind of a sun-drenched scenario, and of course, and you have the popular culture idea of 60s California, of course, being very free-spirited.
Well, yeah, I started college in 1969 in Southern California. I spent a couple of years at Pomona College, small liberal arts school, about 1,000 students. And then after my first 2 years, I moved up to Stanford for my junior and senior years up in Northern California, which is still a pretty small school, maybe graduates. Yeah, so it was a very interesting time. The Vietnam conflict was going on. My friends, colleagues, were being drafted. All of us were quite fearful of being drafted, sent over to Vietnam. So it was important to be in school because most of us were able to get student, deferments. But at the same time, it was also a time because of the influx of two, technologies which were, reliably able to alter consciousness. And, these were kind of coming in, from the West Coast. And kind of spreading throughout the rest of the country, via the Bay Area, or Los Angeles. And these were the psychedelic drugs, the Eastern religious meditation practices. So I learned transcendental meditation when I was junior. I liked it. I like, being able and, concentrate my mind and attain some kind of mildly altered state. Well, the intellectual underpinnings of, TM weren't especially. And after like about a year or so, I was able to, take a class on Indian Buddhism and, discovered Buddhism at that time and was quite attracted to it, both from the point of view of the meditation practices and also its intellectual underpinnings were quite appealing. And, everybody was, taking psychedelic drugs. And, there wasn't really any context for understanding, what was going on in that state. I mean, people were nature, they were going into Buddhism, get, hyper abstract, become, philosophers, those kinds of things. So the combination of those, two, technologies influxing or through the West Coast were quite stimulating as well. In college, I becoming interested in the biology of spiritual experience, and I even took a class from Carl Pribram, one of the fathers of psychology and some extremely interesting theories of consciousness, especially using the perspective of holograms. And I wrote a paper for his undergraduate class on physiological psychology on the spiritual properties of the pineal gland. This was 1971, 1972. So I was, kind of getting into it even, back then. It was interesting. Carl was a very nice guy. He even brought me into his office and said, "This is a great paper, the pineal glands where it's at." And, he encouraged me, to continue with, and at the same time, I started to, dig more deeply into Buddhism and as well. Ended up at a monastery for a short while, a couple of years after that, and that wouldn't have been the case otherwise if I hadn't taken those classes at Stanford and been exposed to the interest in Eastern religious practices and philosophies.
So it really sounds like a very interesting time to be alive, and I'm interested to know about because it's kind of during that time period that psychedelics start to accrue some cultural baggage, and I want to know your experience of prejudice and bias towards more kind of free-spirited ways of life, less repressed ways of life, in the scientific and in the spiritual and religious communities that you were moving in that time.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that question or those questions. At a certain point in college, I went a little off the rails and did that I wanted to go to medical school. I mean, ultimately, but the reason that I wanted, to go to medical school was I wanted to study psychedelic drugs. And, this was 1973. And it was, in the setting of the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, the ending of all research with just a thud. Well, back in the day, you had to write an essay about, why I want to be a doctor and why I want to go to medical school. And I just wrote a really insane essay. And I was doing some research in an embryology laboratory at the time. And I, showed my mentor, my medical school essay, flipped through it and was, shaking his head. And he said, "This is absolutely crazy. You cannot submit this." Number one, psychedelic, drugs are completely taboo right now. Just, tell people you want to help the sick and you want to contribute to the social welfare and you're a scientist and you might want to do research in working in an embryology lab, and the two were closely related. So that was an indication of the stigma that was becoming, the stigma which was becoming attached, to the psychedelic drugs. I applied to like 21 medical schools, and of them, rejected me. And, those, 19 were the ones who asked me, "Why do you want to be a doctor?" And I would just go off. And they would say, "Oh, that's very interesting. See you later." The two schools that did accept me, one was college in Chicago. I think they felt sorry for me. The other one is the school I actually ended up going to, which is Albert Einstein in the Bronx. And a very brief interview took place in San Francisco in a cardiologist, it was an interview, with an Einstein alum, who is a cardiologist. And I came in and he was late, and he was sitting behind this pile of books and journals, and he kind of peered out in the pile, and he said, "Well, do you like to study?" And I said, yeah, I'd love to study. And I was about to, kind of go off on my rant. And he said, "Oh, that's fine. That's fine. As long as you like to study, you'll do fine at Einstein." So that was, my only interview with Einstein. It took less than 10 minutes, and I ended up, getting in there. Even so, after the 9 months at Einstein, I just wasn't quite able to adjust my expectations of what it was like to be a physician with the grind of studying nonstop things that weren't especially interesting. So I actually ended up dropping out of school. It was just a little too much for me at the time. I couldn't quite put the Buddhist worldview, the Buddhist worldview, into any kind of correlative relationship with what I was actually undergoing in school. So I spent about 9 months, traveling up and down, the California coast, and I actually ended up at was kind of flirting with, the idea of becoming a monk. But I think I was actually depressed. And one afternoon, walking, back from the goat shed, or the goat house, my depression just kind of, lifted off my shoulders. I had spent all day, beating on a mountain with a pickaxe and a shovel. That was my project for the day. My depression, just, kind of lifted off my shoulders. And within an hour, I decided I would, return to medical school. And within a month or two, I did. I had, developed a meditation practice, which was quite, grounding. And I also got into, psychotherapy, with a good psychotherapist who I liked and I trusted and respected. And I just kept my interests, to myself. Would carry water. I learned that at the temple, study biochemistry, and take the biochemistry test. So I mean, that was more or less what I did. I put the psychedelics burner. I mean, I ended up and I ended up becoming a psychiatrist. Reasons. At the end of medical school, you have to decide what specialty you'll be going into, and there were a number of reasons why I was interested in psychiatry, but I think one of the primary was that if ever studies in psychedelic drugs, psychiatry would be the most reasonable to do that in.
So I want to backtrack just a little bit to your discoveries at Stanford. If I'm not mistaken, it was neuronal ganglions and their preferences for orientation. That's groundbreaking new discoveries, isn't it?
Well, as an undergraduate, what was I, maybe 20, 21 years old? Yeah, and the embryology, it was actually called, developmental biology. This is kind of obscure, and I haven't thought much about those, those days. But at Pomona, I took a, class in embryology. The development of an organism from, a very small beginning. I became interested in, cells and, and moved. And there was this, phenomena of contact inhibition. It meant that, if two, normal cells, make contact, they stop moving. But in, cancer, those, cells meet, walk over each other, and hence the spreading. Contact inhibition ends up with a single layer of cells in normal cells, and if it's a cancerous cell, then they just kind of pile on, And, for whatever reason, I really, found that fascinating. Like, wow, that's really interesting. Stanford, I was interested in, well, I'd like to do research, and, contact inhibition's cool. So the embryology, professor was a guy. And, I just went over to his laboratory every few days, knocked on his door and said, I'm a transfer student and I want to do, research in contact inhibition. And he'd, look up and scratch his head and say, who are you and why do you want to do that? So I just said, whatever, and kept after him. And within a few months, I was able to procure an undergraduate, research, a spot in his lab. So he was interested in contact inhibition, but I think more specifically, he was into how neurons grew. Why did they, move in this direction? And once they make, contact with their specific, cell type, how. So I studied the neurons in, chicken embryos. He, sent me to 2 projects, suspend, the neurons in a 3D matrix as opposed to only on a flat surface, and, see what they would do. In other words, how much was, dependent on surface as opposed to them kind of spontaneously, growing in, whichever direction. So I developed a, way to suspend those neurons in a matrix. And, that was helpful. And the other thing that we did was in, determining the, growth of the axons was, random or, followed some kind of pattern. So I took, thousands of, pictures of growing neurons, got a protractor and I measured all the angles of all the branches of all of these neurons. That was my, that was how I spent my summer vacation. And it, turns out that there was a, non-random distribution of those angles, which, could have been a result of the structure of the microtubules in, the axon or the skeletal structure. Is, the kind of scaffolding upon, which they grow. It's, kind of interesting in retrospect, because a lot of people are, honing in on the microtubules in, neurons as a of consciousness or, mediator, or, generating consciousness. But back in the day, there weren't any, kinds of concepts like that, circulating. We were mostly looking at it from the point of view.
We had a look at your experience of 60s California. So what was it like to live and learn in 70s New York? I imagine it is quite a scary place.
Well, I in, to my apartment in the Bronx, sat down my first, day in school and said, uh-oh, I think I'm in the wrong place. So, yeah, I just couldn't quite cope. It was just a huge, challenge on a number of levels. Or I just moved out from Stanford. If you've been to Palo Alto, but I think it's probably changed in the last 40 years or so. But the campus itself, it's very idyllic. A forest, buffer, that's around the campus, quiet and beautiful, and greenery everywhere, and a completely liberated. Study Buddhism, great. You want to study the pineal gland, great. You want to learn to meditate, great. I was, able graduate to take a course on sleep and dreams, psychology of consciousness, yeah, all those things. And the Bronx was congested and dirty and smelly. It was hard to understand, people's dialects. Were rough. It was a lot, and plus the students just really bright and really East Coast competitive, which I wasn't used to at all. People at Stanford, even though they were bright, they at least gave the impression of being laid back and mellow. There weren't any. Well, yeah, there wasn't any of that in the Bronx, especially in the Einstein medical school, which was actually a branch of Yeshiva University, which is the only Yeshiva university in the country. So keep up, and didn't keep up, and think that what I was doing made any sense in the context of my larger kind of hypomanic worldview. And so after a while I dropped out, but I returned and I had just a great time. It was a super good school. The teachers were really impressive, very kind, very compassionate. I just kept my nose to the grindstone, and things really were a lot better. Kind of reverting to, I'm going to be the best possible student I could, learn as much as I could, and see what happens. So that was my approach, and I enjoyed the classes. I really enjoyed seeing patients. I had some really great residents and attendings who were inspiring. Thing I might want to mention is, I've got a stammer, and it really was acting up when I was first at Einstein. As I returned, I figured, well, I have to get some help with this. So I, found a good speech therapist. Saved my ass, I'll tell you. She just, kind of re-taught me how to speak. Really a critical part of my being successful when I medical school was, I was able to meditate a lot. I was, probably meditating an inordinate amount of time. An hour at lunchtime, I organized a little meditation group at school, which met during lunch. And after it's psychotherapist, speech therapist, and I just was loving what I was doing and really thriving. So kind of a regulated scene, but it was perfect for the setting. I did great, and choose where I wanted to go for my psychiatry residency, which ended up being UC Davis and Mento. Kept my interests in psychedelics to myself the next number of years, until I was able to actually get in a position to perform the research.
So you had some patients that you would see in New York, and I know that you found yourself sometime later working in community mental health in Alaska, and I would imagine that it was there. Correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but I would imagine it was there that you would have been really coming across patients who were going through mental distress and having your first kind of in the field experiences of administering psychiatric care. Is that right? And I want to know about your just any notable experiences that you had there in Alaska.
The reasons that I went to the residency training program at UC Davis was because it was a community mental health program. Most programs at the time were quite, psychoanalytic. They were, kind of, training you to become a therapist or even more specifically, a Freudian psychoanalyst. Psychiatric medications were still, kind of crude. The antidepressants were kind of hard to prescribe and hard to take. Lithium had, just come out. The antipsychotic medications were extraordinarily toxic. So up until then, the emphasis was on psychotherapy and a little bit of prescribing. Department in Sacramento was kind of cutting edge, and was built upon different models which were coming out. One of them was the improvement in prescribing practices, and another was kind of the that you get people in the community, or you get people in the community. Ronald Reagan was the mayor of California at the time, and he closed all the state hospitals after the passage of the state proposition, Proposition 13. It reduced property taxes, and the income or the revenue going into the state was cut drastically. And one of the measures was to close the state mental hospitals. So there was this flood of chronically mentally ill people in California that were entering the community. And our department was quite keen and cutting edge on mentally ill people, especially the chronically mentally ill, severely mentally ill, to get them treated where they were living. And there were a number of different clinics, like throughout Sacramento County and the city, and I learned to that kind of setting. We also had a extremely busy psychiatric emergency room, which I think was the place of the sickest and patients I've ever seen. Just unbelievable psychopathology. And I think I became interested in really severe psychopathology, during those years. I liked psychotic, completely out of control people. I started off with this view, kind of like, Lang. This is a healing experience. You don't want to medicate them. You want them to work it through, and everything will, turn out well. And my first, day in the, psychiatric emergency room, I was, meeting the, chief resident, and he said, "Well, how do you feel about prescribing drugs?" And I said, "Oh, it's a last resort. And, you should let, people live through their psychosis." So he said, "Okay, come along with me. I've got somebody I'd like to show you." So we walk down the hall, and we enter into this seclusion room, and there's this guy tied down, his feet, even his head, and he starts screaming at us, and he's spitting at us, and he says, "I'm going to kill you." And he just kept on screaming at us, "I'm going to kill you." And so Gary, the chief resident, looked at me and said, "This is a spiritual experience. Do you want to give him some medication to calm him down?" So within a couple of hours of my psychiatric residency, I became converted and figured, well, extreme mental illness is a real thing, and you don't really want to dink around. You want to help people get out of their chaotic state, and then take it from there. So I completed my residency. Sure what I wanted to do. I still see any openings to do psychedelic research, and I still wasn't really thinking about it that much. I liked working with psychiatric patients. I liked the community mental health setting. And, my girlfriend and I were, quite interested in, backpacking in the wilderness. We spent a lot of time in the woods, the mountains, um, and in, the mountains east of Sacramento, the Sierra Nevadas. And, she wanted to go to school up in, Fairbanks. I looked around, and, Fairbanks, seemed like a interesting, city. They had just completed building the pipeline up there, and it was a rich, community. Brown, found a job at a community mental health clinic up in Fairbanks. It was an interesting, but I was just too young out of my residency, and they kind of exploited my naivete in terms of work hours. Like, I was just slammed from the get-go. I had no time off. I was on call 24/7. Contrary to the promises that had made. So I thought to myself, this really isn't working. I just didn't get out to the woods more than once, I think, in a year. So I was still a member of the APA at the time, the American Psychiatric Association. And I would get their newspaper every week, and I started to look in the help wanted ads. The psychopharmacology fellowship was advertising at University of California, San Diego. Interesting. I was becoming interested in research in Fairbanks, especially of the discovery of winter depression. There was clearly a lot of winter depression in Fairbanks, Alaska. There was like a bit of twilight for a half hour in the middle of the winter. And it was a pretty disturbed population. So, people were starting, to write about melatonin as perhaps a, mediator of winter depression. Pineal gland, that sounds familiar. And, melatonin, oh, right. And mental states, and so there was this, so there were openings during this fellowship in La Jolla, and they had, and one of their new faculty members was a guy named Chris Gillen, who had just come out there from NIH, and he was very interested in circadian rhythms and sleep and seasonal depression. Well, this might be interesting. Maybe I'll, see what it's like to do research, and, there's an opening. Pineal gland, maybe I could approach psychedelic, research early, through the pineal question. So I moved down to La Jolla after a year in, Fairbanks, do research. Learned how to do, clinical psychopharmacology research. Find volunteers, get them to, consent to studies, do the studies, collect data, analyze the data, present the data, to your peers, to work on protocols. So that was an extraordinarily, after that, I moved back up to Sacramento as just part-time faculty. Couldn't quite get any research effort off the ground there, and then moved out to Albuquerque like about a year later, and was able to begin my pineal study.
So, if I can just ask you quickly before we talk more about your discoveries concerning melatonin and the biology of altered states of consciousness. If I could just ask you a little bit about psychiatry as a practice. Now, you clearly have a positive view of the practice of psychiatry and have had some plenty of experience in the field yourself. And I'm sure you are therefore aware of this sort of more sinister side of psychiatry, which can be in the for-profit world, and of course this crops up all over the place, where genuinely beneficial and good social organizations and institutions and practices can be kind of twisted to the dark side, if you like, and you end up with this scenario where you have psychiatric disorders kind of invented for the purpose of extorting money from patients, and you have the danger where abnormal behavior, which is not necessarily a medical condition, can become kind of a target where there's this tendency to kind of want to normalize everyone and everything. And I wonder if you have seen that side of the psychiatric world at work, if you have any experience of those types of charlatans in the realm of psychiatry.
Yeah, I mean, of course, but I also think it isn't, specific, or it isn't, specific to psychiatry. There are plenty of specialties, cardiology and infectious disease, and radiology, internal medicine disciplines within the larger umbrella of medicine itself, which can be perverted for personal gain, money, power, influence. But still, I mean, that being said, I mean, I really loved being a psychiatrist. It's been a number of years, since I've practiced, but I only have and good, feelings and good attitudes, towards psychiatry as a discipline. I think that there are unscrupulous, psychiatrists. They're increasing economic, pressure training programs to take, money from, pharmaceutical companies, which obviously have a, vested interest. Back in the day, John Kennedy, and Lyndon and his successor Lyndon Johnson were quite keen on community mental health, and they influential in passing legislation establishing the Federal Mental Health Act, and that was so that was supposed to provide seed money for community mental health oriented practice of psychiatry, which the states were then supposed to gradually take over, and the states weren't able to, especially in California. So programs to shrink, wasn't enough money, and their scope had to be reduced as well. So I think one of the ways in which have been able to keep them, especially over the last maybe 20, 30 years, is to increasingly take money from big pharma. The interesting aspects of our program, and even the one at UNM now, which I adjunct faculty position with, is the emphasis on psychotherapy. I think to become a good psychiatrist in psychotherapy, be supervised in the learning of psychotherapy and the practice of psychotherapy. So it's becoming an increasingly rare program that actually continues to train the residents in psychotherapy. It's interesting. The majority of students who are entering psychoanalytic training are clinical psychologists. They're PhDs rather than MDs. Wasn't the case at all 30, 40 years ago. The majority of people entering analytic training were MDs, and I think it's a result of the emphasis on prescribing biological psychiatry. Well, one of my supervisors in Sacramento was a training analyst, super by the book, Freudian kind of guy, And, he used to, joke about how, psychiatry was losing its mind over the brain. In other words, they just were off, from, psychology, how people thought and felt and acted towards, neurons and, synapses and receptors. If you're being, funded by, drug companies, or if your training is being, driven by drug companies, then you're swimming against the tide by even including more, psychotherapeutic, psychoanalytic modalities. And, that's a challenge, but I think it's a, challenge which is in its own way played out within all of the specialties in, medicine. Cardiology, you make a lot more other kinds of cardiology. If you do lots of angiograms, you make a lot more than you would if you just prescribe, watchful, less, high-tech, radiology. X-rays are cheaper than MRIs, but if you can do MRIs, you make more money. So, it's a, more to the, point, the nefarious aspect of, psychiatry, I thought you were going to, bring up was the MK Ultra, CIA operations, giving unsuspecting citizens LSD and other drugs, back in the 60s. And, the early 70s. And that was completely under the radar. I mean, very few people knew that was going on. A few years back, I, got my hands on all those MK Ultra files, like thousands and thousands of pages. But a 50 to 80% of those, files are redacted. You have no idea who did what to whom. So that's a chapter in the history of American psychiatry, which to remain in the dark, probably forever.
Yeah, I think it's quite a beautiful thing about human beings, kind of a Fitzcarraldo, that we are so vulnerable to being manipulated, but it's that kind of vulnerability also which can be quite sort of beautiful about life and about being alive. But yeah, and the psyops.
Well, the vulnerability and the trust are key in any kind of therapeutic healing. And that was one of the things I always about psychiatry is people. Well, I mean, after you've established some rapport, is people will tell you things that they've never told anybody before. In some ways, the most important person in that person's life ever. Understand them better, more about them than even their parents did in a kind of a non-judgmental, detached, you don't have any stake in the outcome kind of way. And they do a lot of healing by just understanding where people are at, because they don't even know. And for them to be able, to speak in them to a person who just is, listening and is cool and is supportive and likes them. I mean, it can be really a magical kind of a which quite sacred. And I think one of the reasons that we were able to get such incredible stories from the volunteers in my study was because of my psychiatric training. I mean, the stories were incredibly strange, but I had learned to listen to psychotic patients who obviously have some very strange stories to tell. And I was, comfortable and interested and could respond and am in an empathic manner, to all manner of outlandish tales, which I think just a radiologist or a cardiologist wouldn't have quite have been able, to do in that kind of a setting.
Now, it says on your bio on your website that I'm not sure if this is before or after your melatonin discoveries, but that there was a 4-year period of personal psychoanalysis that you underwent. And I'd like you to speak on that. Was that you were psychoanalyzing yourself, or that you had a psychotherapist?
Yeah. I've therapy most of my life. As I discovered, I stammered and it might have some problems in school. I went to a speech therapist when I was 7 or 8. And, we didn't really talk speech. We just, talked about what it was like, growing up. Plus in high school, I, had, some of a speech problem, but, mostly conflict with my, family. And I, found a good speech therapist at the time, who, in the same vein, we mostly just, talk about me and, my relationships. So by the time I, returned to Einstein, after the leave of absence, I was into, finding a, good psychiatrist that I could, work with. So I worked with him for maybe 2 years, moved to, Sacramento, saw somebody once a week for another year or so. My dad died. I was kind of, found another good therapist that I worked with for about a year or two. And then, took a break from being in. I, moved to, moved to Albuquerque, and, things were, kind of settling down. I liked UNM. I liked the people I was working with. And, I was, having, I was having relationship problems. And I thought, well, I'm sick of having relationship problems. Maybe I had to, find an analyst and, go through the gold standard of, psychotherapy. Well, the psychiatry department, the psychiatry department at Einstein was quite, psychoanalytic. Almost everybody almost everybody on, the faculty, had been analyzed, was an analyst. Analysts and psychoanalytic institutes in New York City. So people talked Freud, they read Freud, they were doing Freudian research, they were working with kids in a Freudian manner. And I liked Freud. I mean, he was a really great thinker, and he had a good sense of humor and was a great writer and discovered the importance of dreams and therapeutic relationship. So in the back of my mind, I thought to myself, even as a medical student, one of these days I'd like to, lay on the couch and free associate, to my analyst who's, sitting behind me and isn't saying anything, and just, see what happens. I was having, relationship, problems. I started, seeing an analyst. Well, once I just, woke up and said, I need help. Called, 2 different people. One was an analyst, and the other was a general psychiatrist. And the analyst was the first guy to call me back. I went to see him. We started working together once a week. And he said, well, you want to lay on the couch. Couch? Oh, God. Couch. And it was pretty good. I was able to free associate after some struggle. And then he said, well, 3 days a week, going in, 3 days a week laying on the couch. And well, how about 4? I don't think 3 is enough. 4, I said, well, how about 5? I don't think, 4 is enough. After, how about 6, and he said no. I mean, I need my weekends free. So I, you know, went through a stage of it, you know, lasted 4 years. The entire, you know, 4 years wasn't 5 days a week. I'd say probably be, you know, 2 years of that, you know, 2.5 years of that was, you know, 5 days a week. Yeah, and it was when I moved to Albuquerque, it was between 86 and 90. Melatonin work wound that down. MT work. I wrapped up with him because, you know, he was moving away. Yeah, and you know, it was one of the, you know, best things I'd ever done. I mean, I was incredibly like in debt after I was done. I just, you know, built up this huge debt. I was paying him off for longer. I was in, you know, treatment with him for, you know, 4 years, and I was, you know, paying him off for like, you know, 5 more after that. But still, I mean, it was thing to do. Just, you know, laying there at the ceiling or at the wall, whatever comes to your mind for years. And you know, the relationship with the analyst, quite important, because, you know, they're not saying that much. You know, he might, you know, there were a couple of, you know, sessions, maybe 3. He didn't say a word. 8 times up, and, you know, that was it. Well, you're just spilling your guts, right, after day, really saying anything at all, and you start to imagine what he's thinking, to, you know, share with him and why, and how those imaginations, you know, relate relationships, both as a child and as an adult. You know, so it's kind of a weird laboratory of your mind that kind of gets stimulated through what's called the transference, just the imaginary sort of relationship that you develop with. It was intense. I mean, it was really intense. I mean, after a while, it became more important than my DMT work. God, I have to see my analyst again. So I'd, you know, go in and I'd complain, him things that he wouldn't provide, or have, you know, wishes, or I'd have, you know, fears relating to him, and he would, you know, keep on returning, you know, to me. You know, what does this relate to? What do you want me to do? What I would do, you know, help you. You know, so yeah, I mean, it was great. It was weird. It was expensive, and not many people really would want to, you know, do it, I would think. But a dream come true. Was really quite beneficial.
Sounds like they're kind of...
It also, well, it was extreme. I think, you know, doing my DMT work, learned, you know, what it was like to be completely regressed in the hands of a therapist, in the hands of, you know, somebody sitting there. You know, so I was really able to identify peers who were completely regressed and completely dependent on my good wishes and my interest in them. And I don't think I would have been quite as able to relate to that totally incapacitated, you know, DMT state without, you know, having experience within the psychoanalytic setting.
It's interesting you said that you think that most people probably wouldn't do that, or might not find the inclination or indeed the time or the money to do it. But it sounds like the type of thing that perhaps might become, especially with the reduced amount of output on the side of the therapist, it might be the type of thing that's possible to get AIs to do, AI doctors, AI sort of algorithms to play that role of a kind of a supervisor and someone to invite, or something rather, to invite free association from a patient.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, possible. I mean, we're some way from doing that, I believe, within psychoanalysis, just because of delicacy involved is really quite. For example, I might react to my analyst's tie, or his shoes, or he might pass gas, or he might doze off, or I might hear him scribble on his notepad. So those are things which I would react to. So to be able to build in nuances into an algorithm, it might be cheaper just to find yourself a good analyst.
Yeah, I guess possibly. I suppose you might not be, being such a busy chap, and perhaps maybe fair to characterize you as somewhat of a workaholic. Maybe you probably don't play much computer games, modern computer games. Am I right in assuming that?
Yeah. I don't think I've ever done a computer game. Well, Windows 3.1, a solitaire game on it. So I had Windows 3.1, in the 80s. Solitaire for about an hour. I said this time. So yeah, I haven't. I've not returned to computer games since then.
So your discoveries concerning melatonin, again, groundbreaking discoveries and game changers in a way. Can you talk just a little bit about your experiences investigating melatonin and the way that it, I believe it was light exposure and rectal temperature, if to some degree it was about that.
Well, it was a complicated study. Well, could we take about a 3-minute break?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Okay. I just do my sun salutations. Touch my toes, stretch it out, full body. Yeah. Get my downward dog. I think I'm supposed to hold it for longer than that, but too sensational for me. Oh.
Okay.
Hello. Yeah, sorry to kind of try and put such a complex study in a nutshell of light and rectal temperature. But I suppose if I can rephrase the question, what I mean is to again be involved in groundbreaking discovery. It must have been exciting, and it must have been, you know, uplifting to be on this cutting edge and these like new horizons, and gaining and sharing new knowledge with humankind. I just would like you to talk a little bit about the experience of that.
Yeah, you know, I think I've been really kind of lucky, or and have been lucky. I was telling a friend the other day that every experiment I ever ran, great. You know, the research at Stanford, I had, you know, 2 papers published from undergraduate, you know, research that took, you know, 6 hours a week for maybe a year. You know, even that year in La Jolla as a fellow, I was able to get a, you know, paper published on, you know, thyroid releasing hormone. You know, would, you know, give TRH and you'd study the effects. And it was a, you know, forward study, but it's also, you know, yielded, you know, positive results, and it advanced the field, you know, somewhat. You know, but once I moved to New Mexico, and I was, you know, working under a, you know, endocrinologist, and met him interest in the pineal. You know, people were starting to look at the human physiology of melatonin, and you know, there was, you know, some data, you know, suggesting it was involved in puberty and, you know, reproductive capacity, or extreme, you know, extreme long distance runners develop, you know, no more periods, amenorrhea, you know, the women. You know, so, you know, my mentor interested in the endocrinology, you know, the hormonal effects of, of the pineal gland. And I wasn't with him about my interest in the pineal. You know, in you know, medical school, I was quite keen on studying, you know, the endocrine system, and even at Stanford, I, you know, took a class on, you know, behavior and hormones, which was, I think, the first, you know, behavioral endocrinology class ever taught in an undergraduate school. You know, so I was quite interested in, you know, the relationship between, you know, hormones and behavior, you know, hormones and mental state. You know, so that was kind of a theme that ran through my research ideas and my you know, framing research questions. So the, you know, mentor I was working with at UNM at the time was a, you know, fellow named Glenn Peak, and he said, well, you know, what is known about melatonin in humans? You know, so I would tell him, in the darkness, it had, you know, just been discovered that you could suppress melatonin in humans, which hadn't ever been proven before. This was established in 1980, and I moved to Albuquerque in 1984. You know, so, you know, people had, you know, just discovered you could suppress, you know, melatonin if you gave them, you know, bright enough light. You know, people didn't think it was, you know, possible in humans because they just weren't using. You could suppress melatonin in a rodent, but it didn't require really bright light. You know, the key was the light had to be, you know, bright enough. Well, you know, in addition, group at NIH that discovered, or, you know, that developed an extremely sensitive way to measure melatonin in the blood, which also opened up, you know, the field, you know, to a large extent. You know, so you know, Dr. Peak said, well, if you want to, you know, see what a hormone is doing, take it away. The results are, and then, you know, see what happens when you take it away. in conditions where it, normally is going to be suppressed. Developed a study where we exposed humans, to bright light all night, their melatonin all night, measured a number of, variables, mostly hormonal, luteinizing hormone that's involved in your reproduction, cortisol, which is a stress hormone, growth hormone, whole, battery of endocrine variables, and blood pressure, and, rectal. It was, measured, through a little rectal probe, and, behavior. We, did rating scales for anxiety, those kinds of things. So we completely lucked out. We were able, to suppress melatonin all night. What would occur in response to, the absent condition of melatonin. And, then we, really lucked out because we just kind of, did some, mathematical voodoo and, figured out, well, if we want to give back melatonin in the bright light condition, what kind of infusion rate, like, would, be necessary, like how much melatonin over, how long a period of time at what kind of rate would, reproduce the normal curve secretion. So we just, sat down with our statistician, with the, pharmacokinetic, guy in our lab, and we just, hit the bullseye the first time, and we're able to use the, normal, nocturnal concentration of melatonin that you would see in the, dark condition, in the bright light condition. Close to bright light, but also we're experiencing a, normal level of, melatonin. So that was, the paradigm. Take away the hormone and then you give it back in conditions of suppression. So we looked at all, kinds of variables. We, found, some obscure on the pulse frequency of the release of luteinizing hormone, which is involved in ovulation and, to reproduce. So important, finding, was that melatonin mediated the body temperature, which occurs at 3 to 4 in the morning in humans, and it was the first established, role of naturally occurring, melatonin, published. So in other words, normal in-core temperature would occur at 3 in the morning in, the normal condition. When we kept people up all night in, bright light, bottoming out, temperature went away. We give the melatonin back in the bright light condition, core temperature, drop. So that was, definitive, proof that, normally occurring, melatonin and, physiological concentrations was, mediating that, drop in core temperature. Isn't especially from the point of view of my interest in, the biology of altered states, because I was, keen on, is, melatonin psychoactive too? There were some early data from the 60s and, the 70s indicating it might stimulate dreams, it might have some, psychedelic effects. Kind of hoping against hope that infusing melatonin, nocturnal condition, might produce some, psychedelic effects. And actually we gave, 10 times, too much melatonin to, one guy one night. And, the nurse, called me at 3 a.m. and said, "Oh, Dr. Strassman, guess what? We overdosed your guy on melatonin." "Oh, great. What happened?" And, she said, "Well, we're having a hard time keeping him up." And I said, "Well, is he seeing things or having visions?" And she said, "No luck there." Yeah. So, proof, that, melatonin was, mostly sedating. If you looked at it very carefully in a well-controlled study, it was sedating. It wasn't psychedelic. Yeah, still we published our findings in the best endocrinology journals at the time, and you know it important because it, like I was saying, was the first established role of endogenous melatonin in humans.
It seems like it tells the story of just, and you hear this again and again, of just how important luck is as a factor in scientific progress, and also the standing on the shoulders of giants kind of thing, where you have these previous discoveries made by other groups and these previous advances which kind of snowball to make these further discoveries possible. And now that we've talked a lot about your history and your past, I'd like to talk a little bit more about you in the present. I'm interested first to know if you still meditate and what that meditation routine looks like, if you do.
Yeah, I mean, nowhere near the sane regimen that I used to pursue. Yeah, like after I returned from the monastery and went back to medical school, meditating 3 hours a day. It was kind of unfortunate ways. My girlfriend from California came out to New York, to move in with me, and we had started dating under the monastery, and we both went to the monastery together to spend a weekend, and we both enjoyed it there. But I took to it, water, and she was kind of intrigued, but not that much. And so by the time she moved out to New York, I was meditating 3 hours a day. So I would meditate in the morning before catching the subway up to the Bronx, and I would meditate. I would study my ass off, and I'd meditate before bedtime. And she was just kind of held, was just kind of left holding the ball. Where are you? And I got to study and I got to meditate. So things didn't really work out, because of my, I guess, dedication, to the practice. So I, kind of, continued to pace a lot. I then moved out to Sacramento, started a meditation group affiliated with a monastery that was, supervising my training. And it was, meditating a lot. We had a, group that, met once a week. And, sometimes I would, meditation would, lead the, services, the singing, the chanting, Buddhist, sutras. I would, host monks coming down from the abbey to, lead retreats. I would, write an article for their journal. Extremely thick monastery there for a number of years. But basically they, saved my life. I was depressed. I dropped out of medical school. I didn't know, what the heck. And then when I'm coming, back from the work, session, and I'm no longer depressed, and I go back to medical school. And they encouraged me while I was in medical school to keep at it. It was a worthy thing to do. So they were key in a lot of ways. It wasn't a surprise that I was still meditating that much and extremely dedicated to the discipline. I mean, I was growing up and they were growing up, and we just gradually parted ways. Pagan elements began to kind of grate on me, the bowing, choose for the praying, or to the forces they represent, or to the teachers, living and dead beings, those kinds of things. Like, where was God in all this? And I think also, there was some, growing between stance that I was, seeing in the community to questions, fundamental nature, which to be addressed in a, religious institutional, kind of setting. And, well, like as a rule, within the scientific community, you can ask any question that you want, as long as that question is based on pre-existing data and your hypothesis sound more or less. Within the religious community, well, there's teachings, and you just don't really challenge the teachings as much as you kind of adapt yourself to the teachings. Or you keep quiet with respect to any have with the teachings. So one of my studies, my DMT studies, and questioning them about what might between Buddhist practice and the spiritual properties of the psychedelic drugs. Those were those were questions that just couldn't be asked. It could be just in private spiritual interviews with monks that I had known for 20 or 25 years, but they really couldn't be discussed in a public forum or in other written literature at all. So after a while, I just got kind of tired of me, and it was a bit of a in a way I was subjected to a panel kind of extruded me from the fold. Obviously they had been so important to my life that I grieved. I was pretty upset for like a year or so. They were in my spiritual community, my friends, people I had kind of grown up with. I just couldn't look at my black cushion anymore. It was like, to heck with these guys. If they don't want me, I don't want them. I stopped meditating. I kind of zafu out with the bathwater. Zafu is the black cushion that you sit on. But then like a year or two after that, I had a dream about the teacher. She was looking at me, and she just gave me the biggest smile. And she was young and pretty and completely vibrant, and she just gave me the biggest smile in this dream. And I woke up from the dream, and I thought, I should get to her. Well, she was dead at the time, but still, I have got, or I had my own relationship with her. I still can. I started meditating again. I meditate for maybe 15, 20 minutes, before bedtime. And I just unwind. I just, kind of let it go. And that's kind of my, practice now. And, in the course of the day, sitting at a traffic, maybe 3 in Gallup, but traffic, I can look at my breath. I can kind of, focus, my attention on the moment, and that's very valuable. And I think also one thing I learned from meditating, which so I don't have to struggle on attaining it, is some kind of emotional equilibrium, base of either cognitions or feelings. Like for example, when I began to study the Bible, it's a hard pill to swallow, all the stuff in the Bible. So as opposed to just getting upset and away without really trying it, I could just breathe. I could say, okay, Rick, calm down, meditate, and, sit with this conflict, with the stress, with that the initial reading of the text would evoke in me. Um, I think I'm able to make, or utilize, or carry some of the things that I learned while I was meditating so many hours a day into moments in my everyday life where that's necessary.
How about your diet? What's your eating habits? And I'm thinking for health purposes, how do you maintain your health through your dietary habits?
Well, that's a question nobody's asked me. What do you eat? Well, I mean, this morning I had a vegetable smoothie, some cold cereal, and the vegetable smoothie I made with hemp, and it says guaranteed no THC, and beets, carrots, broccoli, and purple cabbage. For lunch I'll have sardines, usually in a tin, and for dinner I'll usually peanut butter and jam. I love coffee. I'm a total coffee addict, so I drink a super strong, quite as big as my head, but you can get a sense of the size of the cup. Yeah, I think more striking than my diet is my sleep. I require 9 hours of sleep a night. At 9, I wake up at 6. So most people don't get that much sleep. You get 6 hours, 5 hours, 7 hours is a long night's sleep for them. And back in the day when I was a student and a resident, I mean, I would study and I wouldn't get much sleep. But I've heard people, as they get older, they need less sleep. But I like to get to bed at a certain time. I run out of gas around 8:30, quarter to 9, and then go to bed. Get up at 6 or 6:30. And if I've really had a long day, like yesterday, manuscript that some colleagues have from from the University of Michigan, and it's a very dense manuscript. That there's just a lot of data. So I worked all day really hard on that. I think I slept 9.5 hours last night. So I spend a fair amount of my time sleeping. I take it after lunch if I can, and get recharged. So I suppose that's part of why I'm a workaholic, or I try to pack as much as I can into every day as far as studying and work, is because I just don't have that many hours relative to people who get by on 6 hours of sleep.
So you're not a vegetarian, or and you're not hugely specific in your diet. You just kind of eat what you like. Is that fair to say?
Well, I eat for a few years. I was up in the woods college one day, and I won't explain the state I was in, but in any event, and they were serving bacteria. I brought my steak, back, to the table. It was moving. It was pulsating. It was breathing. It was oozing blood. And I don't think I'm eating meat again. So a number of years, maybe 3 years or so, eating meet again when I began, working in the hospitals. And if you wanted to be a vegetarian at the municipal hospital, to just eat cottage, wanted any protein. So after maybe 3 months of just cottage cheese and Jello and these really wilty, I figured, well, I need to start eating meat, or I'm just going to waste away. So I might have I might have chicken once a week, sardines. I like yogurt. Yeah, so I am, fortunate that it's never been easy for me to gain weight. So I could just eat a lot, gain a couple of pounds, and then just, not eat much for a couple of days and get, back to my weight. Like I weigh less now than I did in high school, 50 something now. And in high school, I weighed 165. I mean, I was running track in high school. I was pretty, kind of buffed out. But yeah, I mean, I weigh, now than I did when I was 17.
So you have a healthy diet. That's good. And I wanted also to ask about your interests in, or your tastes rather, in music, poetry, if you're into poetry, and any hobbies or art that you're interested in the present day.
I listen to well, so mostly I only listen to music when I'm exercising, which I do for an hour, before dinner. Just, got a small, palette, or a small, I like EDM. I like Spangle. I'm lots of Spangle at home on my exercise machine. Some, world music from Anna, I think, or Libya. They're called Tina Ruin, spelled Tinarewin. So they have and I listen, happy, upbeat, good rhythm, and classical. So yesterday I was listening to the Bach Brandenburg concertos, great harpsichord music, kind of early, I guess that's what it's called. I like Mozart, I like Beethoven, Shostakovich. Yeah, but I don't listen to music only when I'm exercising. Well, so last night I watched an interesting film called Hardcore Henry.
Yes, yeah, I saw Hardcore
Yeah, I
Henry.
really, yeah, I was into some, mindless, violence, POV, kind of android, cyborg, just, and great movie. The character that plays, Jimmy, is out of ours. I mean, I think that's Oscar award winning performance by that guy. I mean, he was just so versatile and so funny. Brave at the same time. Right. Yeah. So, but like I like romantic comedies too, like the Silver Linings Playbook. Yeah, I've kind of got a wide spectrum of tastes. Documentaries here and there. Last couple of shows. Oh, I like Mr. Robot. I've been watching him. I like The Walking Dead. That's kind of grim, but so much time in my head, like, reading, biblical texts and medieval, commentaries that, by the end of the day, I want to think. I mean, I just want to be kind of entertained and, half hour, 60 minutes at.
That's I like your taste, I gotta say. Do you like poetry? Do you ever read any poetry?
No, not since, the Rod McEwen, days from high school. Bukowski, I used to read a lot of Bukowski. I read all of Bukowski, actually. I went through a Bukowski phase. I read some of his poetry, but I, think his, short stories and his novels are much better. Maybe the only poet I read after finished, college and high school.
And lastly, before we move on to sort of more general DMT questions, I just would like to know if you have a sort of a particular philosophy you describe to you ascribe to when it comes to human nature. So because you have this kind of what appears to me to be a full dichotomy of nature versus nurture in defining human behavior, and then you get some people who will point to original sin and say that humankind are kind of doomed, if you like, to always be warfaring and sinful. And what's your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, they've evolved clearly. Suppose if I ascribe to anyone's approach to life philosophically, studied a lot of the older, philosophers. I mean, Maimonides and Spinoza, Nachmanides, Heschel more recently. But I think if there's anyone who's those are mostly philosophies of religion. The religious philosophies. Like how to think about God and spiritually oriented relationships with people. Kind of perspective of a philosophy of life. The person whose ideas and whose writings I'm most attracted to is a British science fiction writer whose name is Olaf, who wrote in the 30s and 40s, and he wrote a book, a short novel, which is called The Light and the Darkness, or The Darkness and the Light, I can't remember, in the 40s. And two alternative for humanity to take, depending on the choices that they make. One is more tribal, end up slaughtering each other over the next 20,000 years, or the next million years. Rats take over, the big rats. These huge rats are able to the biological niche that humans just were unable to do, just because they couldn't work together, and they broke down into competitive tribes. And the other view is his view of the lightness, the light and the dark. In which case cooperation, hierarchical view of society, where those with skills and aptitudes and interests are able to practice those. A moral government which allows a lot of regional unique, characteristics, to be played out. Like, for example, some people, or, some, regions, depending on the spot on the earth that they occupy, are more, prone to agriculture, maybe more prone to the arts, more be prone to engineering. So I think a little more towards for us to cooperate, but I'm under, no delusion that or capable of cooperating. I think it's, kind of a balance or a, fine line. Well, my Zen teacher used to say, the world is, 51% good and 49% bad. It's up to us to keep that, it's up to each of us to, keep that balance. The dominance of the good. Very easy for things to just slip into the dark, and also there's a Talmudic Talmudic maxim. Important to keep in mind two opposing views of mankind, or of an individual. I think as a member of mankind, is that number one, you're just a piece of dust in the galaxy, and you actually have no impact at all on anything. Well, the opposite, or the balancing, part of the maxim is, that the world was created for you. You have to be good and make the most of it, because everything hinges on your behavior. So that's, kind of in a way, iteration of the Zen, the 51 to 49. Think in the Jewish version of it, it also, partakes of the trope, which, runs through rabbinic Judaism. But at least my understanding of it didn't. But still, I think they both, to the fact that, things remain in an extremely delicate balance. And it's up to each of us to not do harm, and if at all.
I want to thank you for seeing through my kind of truncated and candid questions and delivering such interesting answers. I don't know how much time you have left, Rick, today. Have we got much time left?
In a couple hours, I'm starting to flag a little bit. So, I mean, I'm happy to reschedule, and we could do another couple hours later.
That'd be great. I think that'd be good, just because I'm ready to kind of move on to a whole nother region of questioning now. So if we leave it here for today and reschedule with you for another day for another portion of interrogation. Thank you so much for this. Personally, I found it fascinating, and I just want to thank you again for giving me some of your time.
Well, you're welcome. I appreciate you having me on your show. It's fun.
Okay, I'll see you soon then.
Yeah, just be in contact about when you want to reschedule. Well. So when is your surgery rescheduled for? Do you have a date?
Let's hold on. Let's just we'll stop the broadcast here, but we'll stay in the room, and I'll continue to chat to you. So